So first, speaking about the domestic status of affairs in the Russian industry, it's very important to begin with the analysis of what actually have happened over the past 20 years. 20s and so, we've had a series of actually really conflicting and sometimes interchanging policy concepts. It was quite obvious that 20 years ago the government had launched an unprecedented process of opening up and privatization of the Russian energy industry, which had resulted in some of the industries being almost completely privatized, very seriously restructured and unbundled from the Soviet centralized model. However, this did not happen everywhere. For instance, I'm sure you know obviously that such a company as Gazprom, which controls most of the assets of gas industry, has been preserved as a centralized entity, most reminiscent of the shape it had existed in during the Soviet times. And just last week, tragic news came about the death of Rem Vyacherev, who was the founder and CEO of Gazprom, and actually have led company through preserving its centralized structure during 1990s. Personally, I think that that was one of the most tragic mistake of the Russian reformers, that they didn't do anything about the centralized structure of Gazprom. And President Yeltsin had signed the famous decree of 1st June 1992, which was called о неделимости имущества единой системы газоснабжения, or something like that, about the undivided nature of the unified gas system, which laid the legal and organizational foundation for keeping Gazprom mainly as it is, a Soviet gas ministry. But in the other sectors like oil, coal production, or partly electricity, the government had proceeded with major opening up and restructuring and privatization efforts. In some of these industries, primarily in oil, after some time, basically during the last decade, the privatization and opening up trend had actually reversed back, because the government had started to reintroduce itself with state-affiliated companies taking over some private assets. Some foreign investors have been squeezed out. Some informal and subsequently formal and legal restrictions have been introduced for access of private companies to important areas of oil and gas production, like, for instance, the Russian offshore. Currently, state-controlled companies, according to the law, dominate in this area. So what is actually happening is that the past 20-25 years very much allow us to draw the analysis about how efficient, comparative analysis of efficiency of different policy models, be it privatization versus nationalization, state control, and so on. I suggest, and that's my actually strongest hope, that not only significant academic analysis is being concentrated particularly on that part, that researchers, some of whom you might hear during this excellent series of seminars which Maurizio just introduced, do not just focus on repeating the mythology which is spread out by certain groups of interests and propaganda, but actually go and perform an honest comparative analysis of private ownership versus state ownership. What's the results? What's the downsides? I think to be able to formulate a sustainable model of development for the energy industry, such analysis, such honest, objective analysis is absolutely crucial. Because I think what is very unfortunate is that when this eternal discussion re-emerges on and on about what's most effective, private capital or state, national champions and so on, what you get is that my personal evaluation is what you get is like 99% mythology and propaganda from different sides. And unfortunately, just within 1% of real objective analysis of what's going on. I wouldn't go so far to tell you that I am completely unbiased, because that's not the case. I clearly have my sympathies on certain policy side, because I'm not a classical theoretical academic researcher, never been. I'm a very practical policy manager in the energy area, and the focus of my institute has been always developing policy recommendations based on specific concept, which me and my colleagues believe in. But I will provide you just, if not to go too far into details, but my aim is to provoke you for further analysis of these important issues. I will just give you some hints as to where to look for comparative efficiency analysis between private and state-controlled sectors, because we had enough time and we had enough material to analyze that. So let us, for instance, start with the oil industry. I would just, unfortunately, when I talk to people at the moment, it seems that it's completely forgotten, even by certain advanced people who know how the oil industry works, in what shape and what status it has been 20 years ago. What you had in the beginning of 1990s, when massive privatization was initiated, is that Russia's oil output was in terrible decline. The decline actually, some people believe that the decline began because of the beginning of reforms of the 90s, which is actually absolutely not true, because the decline in output of Russia's oil production had begun in 1988, still under the Soviet government. And the most sharp drop in production have happened, very good to see you. Sharpest drop in production have actually happened during 91, even before Igor Gaidar government took over. And it's a kind of fantastic thing to hear now during these days, but Igor Gaidar government was forced to take specific purpose oil rehabilitation loans from the World Bank, which had totaled at over $1 billion, just to help oil producing companies on the ground to keep up production. So basically government was taking money from the World Bank to subsidize oil production to keep it from falling. It's a sort of crazy thing to hear now when we look at the oil industry as the source of biggest bonanza and rents and profits one can ever imagine, but that was the case 20 years ago. And actually, what happened later is that starting from 94, in 95, 96, most of the oil production in Russia had been transferred to the private hands. Important element is that it was not just a privatization of a single big oil company. Oil industry was divided into actually a relatively big number of independent players. At some point at peak it was 16 independent oil producing companies, initially controlled by the state and then privatized. It then became a subject of mergers and acquisitions and so on, but it was a number as big as that in second half of 90s. And what was important also is that starting from 91, according to initial restructuring idea, the infrastructure, the trunk oil pipeline system, was completely separated. And actually, even the recent trends in Russian policy were not able to reverse that. That was a sort of a grand bargain of the Russian oil industry that Glавtransneft, which was the predecessor of the current Transneft oil company, does not fall into anyone's hands. It remains completely independent. And none of the oil-producing companies actually get access to control of the pipelines. It was a vital condition of securing competitive environment in the oil-producing industry. Even basically under President Vladimir Putin, around 10 years ago. There has been an attempt of Transneft, which was already a much more politically heavyweight company under Semyon Weinstock. Transneft had started to make attempts to acquire some oil-producing fields and become a vertically integrated company instead of just provider of transportation services. It is very important to understand that even Vladimir Putin had interfered, and Transneft was obviously with the push of oil-producing companies, some of them affiliated with the state, but still it was not allowed to buy an oil field, get engaged in producing oil, and was thoroughly kept separated from the rest of the industry, remaining independent from the conflict of interest with oil producers. That was a very important development, which had ensured the relevant development of relevant atmosphere and environment within the oil industry. Now, if we assess the strategic results of all that reform, they were actually striking. Because sometime at around 96, exactly when the major privatization, this notorious loans for shares, auctions, залоговые аукционы, this process was completed, oil production stopped falling. It started to stabilize. And within 3-4 year time, it had actually completely switched to a rapid growth of output. It was such an unpredicted story. Well, initial jump of production by $25 million a year. And it was such an unpredictable story. So that I remember myself, I was a part of the governmental group drafting Russia's national energy strategy to 2020 at the moment, and it was December 2001. My minister, who was Igor Yusupov at the time, who was chairing the group, he was absolutely mocking and making joke out of the ministry's strategic department because they brought a draft of this document with forecasts of Russia's oil output for 2020 at the optimistic level as 350 million metric tons per year. And already by the end of 2001, the actual output was achieved at the level of 348. 48 million tons a year above the level of 1999. So ministries, government strategies were not coping with actually getting the actual information about impressive growth at the private fields. They were sitting in their offices and being absolutely unaware of what private owners actually did to improve the efficiency of performance of the oil-producing companies. So it was an impressive growth which lasted for several years and actually brought Russia to a completely new level of international oil industry importance. We are now, since then, stable level of production above 500 million tons was achieved. We are somewhere in the same league, the highest league with Saudi Arabia. And actually, there is also a lot of mythology which have been propagated around this issue of impressive growth of early 2000s as far as the oil industry is concerned. I just have to tell you a few things. First, one of the myths is that that was happening because of the low-hanging fruit, because of Russia's oil industry had a big number of unused conserved oil wells, and they were just rapidly started to use them, and the production started to grow. That is factually untrue, simply because before the beginning of the rapid growth in 1999, and at the time when the growth was largely brought down to very low single digits in 2005, the share of idle wells of the total number of oil wells in the Russian industry was roughly the same, somewhere around 20%. It didn't fall. What changed, though, was the average productivity of one well. It jumped by around 35% roughly within that period. So much greater efficiency and productivity was achieved regarding oil extraction. And that was obviously done by bringing in the most experienced international players in enhancing the oil output, like Halliburton or Schlumberger, which I'm sure Dominic has a lot of knowledge about. So that was a growth driven by technology enhancements, increase of productivity, and yet even on the other part of the story, a very massive investment in increasing the oil production. Because there is, again, another myth is that the oligarchs which had privatized the oil industry in Russia in the 90s, I'm not justifying any of them. I'm just telling you the facts. A lot of people actually say that what they did with these private oil companies is just taken all the profits to buy yachts, real estate in Côte d'Azur or everywhere. That is factually untrue. That is corrected even by the official Russian statistics, because the statistics say that these companies had basically reinvested 90% of the profits in increasing oil output in Russia. Just take alone the ЕУСПб company, which was, no, you obviously know the ЕУСПб case, so I won't go into much detail. What is important to understand about ЕУСПб is that ЕУСПб was the first company to actually develop from a completely greenfield status and launch into on-stream production the biggest new field in the post-Soviet time, which was Priobsky field, which was producing almost zero oil in 97-98 when ЕУСПб established control over the Priobsky field. And at the same time, it was discussed in Russia and in the government that Russian companies are so weak that we will not be develop this field alone. We need foreign partners, we need production sharing agreements, and so on. However, what happened is ЕУСПб had completely rejected the idea of foreign partnerships, invested over $2 billion of its own money in development of Priobsky, and brought the production up from zero to over 20 million tons a year just at this field alone. So basically, when Rosneft had taken over ЕУСПб in 2004-2005, they just inherited the thing which was already up and running. That is just one illustration of how efficiently private companies had worked. There are many other examples, be it the projects of Lukoil in Timano-Pechora and Northern Caspian, where in Northern Caspian was the first region where Lukoil had started to make first big post-Soviet discoveries. There are other examples as well. However, the whole story was a relative success story. It did bring the oil industry, despite a lot of shortcomings and problems, which we can talk more about, but it had brought it to a completely new level. We talk a lot about modernization in Russia these days. A lot of people hardly understand what this word means. But that is actually what have happened in the Russian oil industry starting from mid-90s up in the following decade with the help of private capital and private initiative. Russian oil industry under private control, where private sector controlled more than 90% of production, it had been substantially modernized in a way which should have been used as a model, in my personal opinion, for development of the whole country's economy, because that was a very strong success story. Now, then different trends started. Government started a big comeback in the oil industry, established control over significant assets, ЕУСПб, Sibneft, actually leading to increase of states' control over oil production from below 10% to just about 40%. It's going to turn even bigger now with the acquisition of TNK-BP, where government's control over oil output in Russia will exceed 50%, which means that's a kind of important psychological change, because state oil-producing industry would start to formally dominate after 20 years of privatization policies. Now private sector in oil will be pushed back to some sort of limited and marginal role. What happened is that starting from 2005, after the big comeback of the state, the average growth of oil production per year had declined to somewhat 1.6%. 1.6% a year, compared to average 8.4% from 2000 to 2004 inclusively. If you want to compare efficiency of private sector versus national state-controlled sector, question number one, how can you explain that sharp decline in output growth rates? Another important issue is that despite certain developments, continuing developments of greenfield oil production in certain new regions, from Timano-Pechora to Caspian to Eastern Siberia, great majority of new projects were actually carried through by still the private capital, be it Lukoil in Timano-Pechora or Caspian, be it TNK-BP in Irkutsk Oblast or UVAT project. There were just few exceptions where state companies have really delivered on development of new projects, like Rosneft at Vankor. So I think if you analyze who have contributed most greatly to development of new greenfield areas, to me the answer is quite obvious. It was the private sector. Maybe your research, if you follow that topic, would suggest different outcomes. I'll let you try. It is important, again, it is important to have an honest and objective discussions of that issue. On the other hand, these are very clearly comparable cases, because oil industry in Russia and gas industry are similar in a lot of ways, primarily because the production is focused in nearly the same area, which is Western Siberia. Market delivery routes are pretty much the same with comparable system of pipelines. So it's actually really worth, if you are considering and discussing different policy models, it's really worth comparing how things went in both industries. We've now discussed the picture in the oil industry. Now let's turn to Gazprom. Late 1990s. What Gazprom had as a far advantage compared to other energy industries, it did not experience such a sharp drop in production during the 90s as oil or coal industries. No, production was relatively flat. Gazprom was more or less okay. It had centralized revenues from exports and did not have the problem of declining export revenues because different suppliers competed with each other in the international market. No, export revenues were centralized. It had relatively new capital stock, newly introduced gas fields, relatively new pipelines, compared to much more outdated stock in the other industries. Results, after all these years, just take a look at the formal results of Gazprom in 2012. Gas output is hanging somewhere at the levels where it was in 1999. Gazprom is losing European market big time. We can talk about that more considering the international situation, but Gazprom has been squeezed out from the international market. It is now, I strongly advise you not to follow Gazprom's announcements where they use, every time they make a good press release, they use a different base for comparison. Just browse a Russian customs statistics website, customs.ru. It's a bit tedious because they don't have it all in one place, you'll have to look. But they have a monthly statistics of exports of natural gas. So what we have now is we have exports of gas to the so-called far abroad, дальнее зарубежье, which is beyond the former USSR borders. More than 1/3 less than it was in the peak year of exports, 2008, when we exported over 150 BCM a year to the far abroad. It's around 100 now, and it's in decline. My personal prediction, because I have been following this industry for a long, long time, I would dare give you a precise prediction. Gazprom would never, ever come back to the level of gas exports it achieved to Europe in 2008. Never. Because of its fundamental uncompetitiveness, which is the major reason why the company is losing market now. Take everything, labor productivity, output per one employee, average productivity on one well. Nothing, basically. I would strongly advise, if there are some fans of Gazprom in the room, I strongly advise you, encourage you actually, to give me some positive example. What was achieved over the past 20 years? compared to the oil industry. Oh yes, after long years of hesitation, Gazprom finally started to move way up north and develop Bovanenko. Coincidentally, it did turn out to be very costly, but coincidentally, the first scheduled supplies of gas from Bovanenko and Yamal Peninsula actually coincided with sharp decline of market in Europe and the CIS. So the question is now not will they be able to cope with increasing demand, but the question had sharply shifted to whether new gas will be needed at all. I don't think that this is something which can be characterized as a positive type of developments. There's also one more element to it. If you take a look at gas and oil industries combined, what was an important development is that around 10 years ago, government started to initially informally and then formally in 2008 the relevant legislation was adopted, transferred the exclusive rights and monopoly of development of the Russian oil and gas offshore resources to state companies. So as of now, for 5 consecutive years in a row, Gazprom and Rosneft enjoy a formal legal monopoly of developing the Russian offshore. De facto, with the cancellation of Sakhalin-3 negotiations with Americans, such a monopoly was informally granted as far as in 2003. So we have now 10 years of domination of Russian oil and gas companies in development of the offshore. What are the results? I strongly encourage, again, to all of the fans of Gazprom in the world, that my question goes simple as that. Can they show example of a positive result of development of the Russian offshore under the domination of Gazprom and Rosneft? Still, what we got are the 2 projects which were completely developed by foreign investors, Sakhalin-1 and Sakhalin-2, which are up and running, delivering and producing oil and gas. What we have instead on the part of the state companies, other Sakhalins, nothing happens, 0. Stockman cancelled so far. Преразломная, disgraceful story with many postponements of beginning of initial production. Still not happening. We can talk about this more in detail. So my suggestion is that the performance of Russian state oil companies, so-called national champions in development of the Russian offshore, the biggest new province for our oil and gas industry, has been a complete failure over the past 10 years. This is why actually shy rumors had reiterated in the recent years that maybe we need to allow somebody else to do that because these guys are not efficient enough to perform the task. I'll just conclude this internal analysis with another important analogy, which also goes back to this privatization versus nationalization question, which is the coal industry, which was the biggest headache, economic and political headache of the Russian government 25 years ago. Actually, for those of you who have been following political events in the late Soviet Union, they know that the miners' strikes has been one of the pillars in an anti-communist movement, which did lead significantly to weakening of the communist regime. What happened in the coal industry's early 90s, the situation was even more disastrous than in oil. It was a sharp decline in output. It was extremely low labor productivity with 1 million people employed, and the sector receiving over 3% of GDP in direct subsidies for coal production from the state. After that, I think, which is, Vladimir, particularly, I think we need to discuss this issue further, because this is, to me, this is the #1 underestimated successful reform of 1990s, the coal industry reform. I think they even have a monument of Gaidar and Chubais in Kemerovo Oblast, in one of the coal-producing cities. Because what have happened is that the industry was privatized. Labor productivity, just within less than a decade, by the end of 90s, labor productivity jumped 2 times. in 2001 compared to 1992. Subsidies reduced from over 3% of GDP to 0. Right now, for several years, coal industry receives just like $200 million in annual subsidies, not to the existing enterprises, but these are subsidies which goes to subsidize the closure of non-efficient mines and social spending on workers who are being transferred to other jobs. Zero money for more than a decade now is being spent on subsidizing the enterprises, whereas we did spend more than 3% of GDP on that in 1991. For the first time in the whole history of Russia, Russia as the country, well, RSFSR, Russian Federative Republic within the USSR, was always a net importer of coal. It produced coal far less than it consumed. Most of the coal in Soviet Union has been produced in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. For the first time in Russian history, Russia had become a net exporter of coal to the world market starting from 1997. And what is even more important, Russia had outpaced such an important international coal suppliers and exporters like Vietnam, South Africa, and China. For many, many years now, we occupied a third position in the world in terms of supplies of coal to the world market, only after being third after Australia and Indonesia. Which means that what have happened with complete exit of state from the coal industry, very important restructuring and market reforms, we had created an extremely efficient and internationally competitive sector. Something which never existed within the Russian coal industry before the beginning of reforms. Now, think of Gazprom again. So basically what is the strategic crossroads for us at the moment is that obviously things are starting to become more and more difficult in Russia's domestic energy affairs, because to be able to keep up with our energy output production, we need to go and develop much more difficult areas. More investment, more skill, more technology, more efficiency is needed to take on that important challenge. It is absolutely vital to successfully achieve that, to redefine, to understand under which model we do it. Under the open, transparent, market-driven model with private initiative and sometimes foreign investment taking the leading role? Or do we follow the centralized monopoly model under state control, which is based on the idea of national champions? That choice is vitally important for the success of development of these new greenfield areas of production. If we choose the wrong model, that development might be postponed for many, many years and decades, and we might significantly lose our positions in the international energy market, and our energy sector will again become from a center of super profits will shift towards a center of certain headache for the authorities, requiring subsidies and so on, if only we choose the wrong model. So again, I would just bring you to important idea of having an objective analysis of which model is better. I think we lack this discussion. Very much lack this discussion in Russian society now. Very good objective comparative analysis of the two models. When the government had issued a quick no objection to the acquisition of TNK-BP by Rosneft. Now, I have never seen a government or pro-government analyst produce a white paper or impact assessment of what happens, what will be the effects of acquisition of TNK-BP. No. There was no such open, comprehensive analytical paper released. The government just approved the deal like that. I think that was wrong. I think we need to revisit the whole strategy, and we need this good comparative analysis of two models. Just shortly switching to the international arena, I think it's also quite obvious that in those industries where we did have a significant privatization, restructuring, and opening up, can you recall I would strongly welcome if some of you might recall an example of difficulties which we had at the international markets while exporting our oil or coal. I've just illustrated you the coal story, success story of becoming #3 world exporter after being a net importer always. In the oil industry, now, can you recall a story where there's been reports that Russia is losing European oil market big time, or we have a price supply standoff with Ukraine cutting off oil supplies or something like that? No, I personally don't recall that. I think also our positioning on the international markets of oil and coal was very successful, which I think, I suspect has something to do with the fact that private owners has been basically motivated to do the effective marketing job, promote themselves internationally, and conquer the markets, which they did. However, in the gas situation, it's a bit different. Moreover, I have to say that there's one aspect which I wanted to focus specifically, is that the government, particularly it coincided with a big comeback of the state in the oil and gas industry and the reinstallment of control and so on. We also started to flirt with the idea that we might establish a big, solid and lasting partnership between Russia and China, which is another, actually an economy much bigger than us, right near our borders, which is extremely dependent on energy consumption, and which is where strategic sectors of the economy are also controlled by government, which the centralized government-controlled philosophy is also dominating in policy. It was clearly a big idea of Russian policymakers in the recent years that we are actually aiming towards establishment of a big alliance, international geostrategic alliance in energy affairs with China. I have to say, though, that it's seemingly not working. Because first, let me remind you that almost 7 years ago, in March 2006, Vladimir Putin had visited Beijing and signed a preliminary agreement with Chinese that Russia will build a pipeline capable of delivering 30 BCM of gas to China, and then it might be expanded. After 3 weeks since Putin departed from Beijing, same visit was paid by former Turkmen President Niyazov. And he signed a similar agreement, 30 BCM pipeline with potential future expansion. 7 years have passed. Turkmen pipeline is up and running. It's operating for several years now, delivering gas. And China had completely outplayed Russia as far as control over Turkmen gas exports is concerned. Russia is currently occupying a disgraceful third place in the rank of countries by volumes of imports of Turkmen gas, being third to China and even Iran. The pipeline in Russia, now those of you who follow the energy news, international energy news, might recall that very frequently, from time to time, every couple of months or every 3 months, news come up that very soon Russia and China will sign specific agreement on gas supplies and construction of pipeline and so on. It's just going to happen very soon, maybe at the next St. Petersburg forum, maybe a few weeks after that. This news circulate for 7 years now, and it's not happening. And there's a reason for that, because although China yes, it is a very important international energy player and consumer, and it's very dependent on energy imports. However, there is a big problem with that, because China is still very much a coal-producing and coal-consuming country. It is the major country's energy resource. It's 70% in their energy mix. And gas is only marginal. So far, China is currently consuming only over like 130 BCM a year, which is not just a small number, relatively small number. It is important to understand that China also is a significant producer of natural gas, and the production is strongly growing. It's currently producing over 100 BCM of its own natural gas. And the domestic output of gas in China had increased by 50% just within the recent six years, which leaves China with only 30 billion cubic meters a year, only 30 billion cubic meters niche for demand for imports. Is it big? By all means, no. Actually, it is important to understand that China also, on one hand, is pursuing a very strong policy of diversification of imports. It doesn't want to be dependent on one source. It wants to import gas from different sources. If you take a look at the decomposition of Chinese gas imports, it's coming from very different sources. Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Turkmenistan has started to play a vital role. Maybe some gas will be bought from Russia, but given these figures and circumstances, I assume it's normal to expect that the share of Russia at the Chinese gas market is not going to be big. So unfortunately, if someone had these rosy expectations that China will be like an endless market for our natural gas, it's just not the case. It's never going to be the case. And there is a reason why the gas negotiations on supplies from Russia and potential construction of a pipeline has stalled. It's the pricing issue, because Gazprom wants the price to be similar of that to Europe. And Chinese, when I used to work in the government, I have been part of that negotiations. Chinese have been always saying, like, guys, we have a clear, rational economic benchmark, which is domestically produced coal. If buying Russian gas will be more effective than burning our own coal, we can consider. If you're going to offer us more expensive gas, it's just not working. That was always pretty much similar, very economic, very rational logic to the negotiations, and it did work. So what is another important conclusion from this years of trying is that the policy idea of switching, grand switch of Russian supplies, energy supplies towards Asia, in particular China, is just not working. Which means that we still need to focus on our destiny target main market, which is Europe. European market is obviously becoming more and more competitive, particularly in natural gas, particularly because of the shale gas revolution in North America, which basically virtually closed North American market for important LNG. And most of the LNG producers were forced to redirect the supplies towards Europe, which brought down prices. I think the development in shale gas in the US and other parts of the world will basically have this somewhat similar effect as with coal production, because international coal prices are being depressed and kept down, because everybody has it. There is no geopolitical and geostrategic dependence on very few producers of coal. You can buy coal from almost everywhere. Most of the countries produce it. And a lot of countries also have reserves of shale gas, even countries which have never been regarded as natural gas producers. You saw a lot of reports of a potential development of shale gas resources in strange places like Lithuania, which have previously been regarded as the energy desert. And now all of a sudden they have flowers, if you will. So basically it's quite clear that, to conclude my introductory remarks, given also the factor of not only shale gas, but general investment of technology, rapid development of LNG, one more failure because it was quite clear that LNG will make international market much more flexible and competitive, but Russia had basically failed all over these years to effectively enter it, because the only thing that we have so far is an LNG plant at Aniva Bay in Sakhalin built by Shell and Japanese. It's the only thing we had. Gazprom is actually not even in an effective stage of planning of another LNG plant. Let's make it absolutely clear. It's having some preliminary negotiations about Vladivostok, but it is not even now, not even in 2013, is engaged in development of a new major LNG plant. How can you compete at the international market with greatly increasing flexibility when you do not produce LNG? It's also important to understand that the production of shale resources will have a tremendous effect on the international oil market as well. If you just take a look at the recent World Energy Outlook issued by International Energy Agency in November, what you see is that King Hubert's peak oil theory has been humiliated. Because you know all these discussions about peak oil reaching a certain level of production and then inevitably falling and so on, and that's irreversible, some kind of apocalyptic pictures, you know, and so on. What we have now is basically exactly the reverse trend has started to emerge in the United States. Oil production in the recent 6 years is up 20%. Largely because of shale oil, and the International Energy Agency is now going too far as to predict that by 2020, U.S. the biggest. It's also an unimaginable thing. U.S. the biggest oil importer ever would become self-sufficient in oil and might even become net exporter at least for some time. Just take a look at recent developments at the international gas market to make a conclusion that it's not impossible at all. And second, just think about the strategic consequences of that. That might change the international energy world forever. So, if someone hoped that he will be exempt from competition because energy resources are concentrated in just a few countries, there's big inertia, capital investment, nobody will escape the domination of Russia, Venezuela, and Persian Gulf countries. Somebody who assumed that and had been repeating it in his presentations all over the years, he's been flat wrong. Competition at the international energy markets is back, big time. And now, these days, to a much greater extent than ever before. What is vital and what is essential I believe that Russia is always destined to be a very important energy producing country. And that is not at all bad, because some people would go with this, you know, resource curse theory. There are countries which are quite effective mineral resource economies, and resource curse seemingly doesn't work there. Take Norway, Australia, Canada, Brazil. They have been able to positively use the effect of resource wealth, not turning into a resource curse. Take, on the other hand, other countries, very big countries like India or Ukraine, which are not very rich with resources and also democratic. And they are more corrupt, and there are more problems with development than with Russia, for instance. I have to say that it's not necessarily, resource countries are not destined to follow the curse pattern. I believe that Russia can actually effectively develop as a country which does play an important role at the international energy markets, produce and export energy resources. However, it's becoming a much more difficult story. You need to spend a greater effort developing your domestic resources. It's becoming much more difficult. We need to move to areas unexperienced before, like the offshore. You need to be more competitive internationally, which is also appears to be a challenging task, particularly for Gazprom. Big change is coming. I think it imposes a huge challenge on Russia in terms of rethinking its policy, making the vital policy choices. I don't think enough time and effort is being spent on the honest and objective discussion about these policy choices. I think some of the policy choices are artificially imposed on us, and they are probably leading in the wrong direction. Sorry for taking, I think, much more time than I initially expected, but I think probably we should move to questions now.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that our couple of interviewers may take the floor. They're going to lead the discussion. They're going to ask you several questions, and then hopefully we'll still have some time for other questions from the audience. Yeah. Here they are. You can introduce yourself first.
Okay. I'm Nick. I'm a student in the energy program here. Thanks a lot for coming to speak with us. My question is about Gazprom's pipeline system, the domestic pipeline system. And recently there have been some independent gas producers who wanted access to the Gazprom system and have run into some problems because Gazprom controls it and seems to be kind of stubborn about it. But recently they've won some court decisions against Gazprom. And then in 2010, Putin said that if Gazprom can't be responsible with their pipeline system, then it might have to go to some other companies. And then recently, in response, I guess, to all of this, it seems like a changing tide. Gazprom said in a press release that they kind of blame the independent suppliers for clogging the pipeline system and so that there's just simply not enough capacity. I'm wondering if you think that Gazprom will be forced to relinquish control of the pipeline system, or how this might play out.
Thank you. I will just answer in several parts. The first part is that, to be honest, there is no such thing as independent gas producers in Russia, because they might be independent from Gazprom, but they're at the time being integrated part of existing vertical system. Rosneft is a state-controlled company. Novatek might seem as an independent private gas-producing company, but it's owned by Gennady Timchenko. You know who he is. I have been in court. He sued me for libel for my book, Putin the Results, so I know a lot about this man. Well, he is the guy obviously clearly connected with Vladimir Putin's clan. So a company owned by him cannot be considered an independent gas producer. So it's important to understand that that's not a market regulatory process which is subject to laws and rules and so on. That is a kind of an administrative bargain within virtually the same room. Although, of course, there is a contradiction of interest and so on, but the ultimate decision for access to pipelines for these particular companies is just, you know, maybe only fractionally it's connected with some legal mechanisms, legislation and so on. 99% the result would be this administrative bargain which happens behind closed doors. So my best advice is not to focus too much on the legal aspect of that access. In the present conditions, it matters not really much. Another issue is that I have been involved professionally deeply into this issue of access to pipelines since 1997. So I know a lot about this story. I was when Putin, not even when he became president, but when he was just appointed a prime minister and Yeltsin's successor, was one of the first things he promised as far as the energy policy was concerned, is that I will make sure that the independent gas producers get their access to pipelines. This is what he said. Particularly this had been related to the dry gas produced from associated gas from oil fields, which is, you know, the gas flaring problem in Russia. There was always a literally burning issue. And when I used to work in the Federal Energy Commission, I was the author of the draft resolution of which was targeted at improving the access rules for independence, which was finally adopted by Kasyanov's government on 3rd of May 2001. I can send you a link. You can take a look at how this works in practical mechanisms terms. There was just one single issue, which was, and because we knew where to look. for the dead rat, if you will, right? It was one single issue over which there was a major conflict with, between government and gas. My commission was developing this resolution, so it was a direct conflict between myself and Gazprom. We said, give us the full disclosure of the actual information of the structure of load of the pipeline. You say there's no space. Let's verify that with numbers. Oh, you can't imagine how they defended just that. They were surrendering on everything else. They say information of the actual load of the system. No way. It's a state secret. Disclosing it undermines state's national security. We said, okay, let's issue an order, a resolution, when you would disclose that only to few individuals in the government who have the ministers, literally, or maybe deputies, right? Who have the access to top secrets and basically submitted their signatures that they will never disclose, or should they will be punished, persecuted, whatever. Just few individuals under a high regime of secrecy. They said, no way, still undermines national security. At the end of the day, it was excluded. From М.Касьянов we had tried to convince М.Касьянов. М.Касьянов understood the importance of it. Now, what we have, as far as the actual information about the structure of Gazprom system load is concerned, apart from a few bottlenecks, which is solvable, just few hubs, which should be addressed, it can be done in 1 or 2 years, problem should be solved. The average free capacity of Gazprom system is like 30–40% easily. There's plenty of room for gas from independent producers, right? But they do not want the public to know it, because it undermines national security. So actually, this is, in practical terms, this is actually, when they deny somebody access, this is the explanation that they use. There is no space. It's all filled with our gas. And it's not verifiable, because this information is not available and kept hidden. And why it kept hidden and why Gazprom was always able to win is that, you know, they always existed as a separate state within a state because of the 2 consecutive decades spent under high protection of top politicians. In the 90s, they enjoyed wide protection from Chernomyrdin. Whenever certain government agencies tried to interfere in their affairs, they said, look, we're working directly with Prime Minister. What do you want? I mean, some energy commission asking us for some information. We already given it to Chernomyrdin, ask his stuff. That was the talk. They had 3 very difficult years when they really had to confront the government, and actually the chair had started to shake underneath Vyacherev after Chernomyrdin's departure and before Putin took over. That was a challenging time for Gazprom. They really had to, you know, to do something about it. But then the savior came. Basically, they had achieved a much stronger political protection. This time they started to work directly with the president. So there was basically no need for them to actually explain their actions and so on. Every time Miller had a confrontation with government on issues like, you know, access to pipelines and whatever, he just wrote a letter to Putin. And Putin signed. I mostly agree with the chairman of Gazprom. Government, please take my opinion into account. This is how it ended up. So as to your story and access to pipelines, access can happen in a modern environment from time to time on a bargain basis, political bargain, depending on political weight of certain influentials who are behind that, be it Sechin at Rosneft or Timchenko at Novatek. That will, however, not be a result of some kind of policy process, legal process, just bargain, just a little more than that. Yeah.
I have kind of a follow-up question. So you've got 3 big personalities with Miller, Sechin, and Timchenko in terms of gas-producing companies. How do you, and since the personal relationships are so important with how these companies communicate with each other, how do you see the state of those relationships now? Do they get along?
You've forgotten another important person, which I think is a bit bigger than the three of them, which is Putin. No, it's a bit more serious than meets the eye, because I'm convinced that since the installment of Miller as a nominal CEO, Putin was de facto the acting CEO of Gazprom. Miller was, it's not that he's not important. He plays some role, but it's actually the facade. Because key decisions over Gazprom are made personally by Putin. On certain transactions, well, there is, you know, dispute between other people, whether it's a minimum $20 million transaction or $50 million transaction, but it's quite clear that something within that range, it means that Putin has veto power, and actually it should be agreed with him. He should give no objection for any such transaction to go on. Or personal appointments, basically a lot of manager decisions. Miller is not independent, and Putin, it's his company. He's very much, if you see him talking at certain international press conferences and so on, being asked the questions about projects like Nord Stream, have you ever been following his extent of detailed knowledge about each compressor station, where it's located precisely, what's the capacity, how many people working there? He's overwhelming in terms of knowledge about how these details go on. That can be the sign of only one thing, that he's actually taking part in decision making and all that stuff. At least he's briefed before things formally happen. I think it's important. So it's not the rivalry of three more or less equal or comparable figures. No, you have somebody on top of the pyramid who acts as an arbiter. Now, as to relations are concerned, first, I think for Sechin, it is still important to define his precise role. At the moment, it's not very clear. What is his vision of development of Rosneft and its role? He is actually, in a lot of ways, he's acting like a person who is far beyond Rosneft interests, and he wants to build something bigger. In fact, he is a dual capacity now. Rosneft is the company, the existing company with certain projects, ideas, vision, focus, field of activity. And you have Rosneftegas, which is meant to be a much wider umbrella for a totally different, much broader range of activities. I think the problem of Sechin is that he's torn apart between that different capacities, the big capacity and the bigger capacity, right? And Dominique might not necessarily agree with me, but I believe that eventually, over time, he's going to be drowning with that, within that choice and that multiple challenges, because these challenges are so important and so huge and take such a great professionalism. So it takes a figure much bigger than Sechin to overcome that. I think what is happening now with, if you take a look at the media, the publications just today, he's already drowning in these multiple electricity asset conflicts with the government, Dvorkovich and others, right? In some cases he's taken over, in some cases he's losing, but it's quite clear that it's such a consuming effort. It's very difficult to, you have to choose who you are. You cannot act in multiple capacities at once. I think that is his problem. As far as Timchenko is concerned, Timchenko is much smarter. And he's a guy who is much more truly focused on the business side of things. This is actually why he is relentless on insisting on one specific issue, solving one specific task. Getting the permit to directly export gas from Yamal LNG project, which is vital. I think that so far the behavior of Gazprom towards Timchenko and Novatek has been characterized by some visible concessions. They've been given away some of the issues previously unthought before. major LNG project, developing major fields in Yamal and Gedan peninsulas, even the discussion about potential direct marketing of gas, some concessions on the domestic gas market, and so on. With the previous over-domination of Gazprom in the Russian gas-producing industry, it was something previously unthought of completely. And that is, on one hand, the result of direct interference with Putin, because Putin told them to stay down. This time, he said, this time we allowed my friend Timchenko to do this and that, and you stay down. This means that there is an arbiter to this triangle which you've mentioned before. Another important aspect is that these concessions are starting to look somewhat similar to Vyakharev's behavior in his late years at Gazprom, late 90s and early 2000s, when he's also been generously given certain assets to France, particularly new greenfield assets for development. However, I think also that Gazprom, this is why all the recent bargain about access for Yamal LNG to exports, is because Gazprom realizes that this sudden rise of Novatek is currently becoming a sort of existential threat for Gazprom, because it undermines some of the core foundations of their monopoly. Export markets. I think they had started to become more active in this regard simply because they felt that some of the consumers, current and potential, with whom they negotiate, had already at least started to wait for the opportunity to directly talk to Yamal LNG guys. This is something which fuels Gazprom's anticipation with granting Novatek right to directly export gas, and you see this issue have been halted down significantly even at the Presidential Commission on the 13th of February. So I hope that briefly answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you very much for coming in. You've told us a little bit about what you think should happen in order to sort of, quote, modernize or reinvent the Russian gas industry. But my question is actually what you think will happen and how you think the timing of politics will influence that, whether you think the role of the state will increase, as in, there will be a more centralized, you must invest here, do this, or if you think it'll be more laissez-faire, and if you think Gazprom will change structurally, for instance, maybe only being an export market oriented, or if you think it'll be more procedurally, will they'll actually look into changing their pricing mechanism.
Well, I think, to make a long story short, under the current political regime, I do not expect at all any possibility for a dramatic change of policies. So it's going to be pretty more like the same. Maybe with certain attempts to give more flexibility, more ground to private players, but this will be confronted by the appetites of the elders, the champions, to keep the situation as it is, pretty similarly to the scheme we described now about the Yamal LNG, or the collapsed Stockman project, which the collapse had a lot to do with Gazprom's inclination to dominate in all decision making, which does not allow real partnership to emerge. The partnership, as these Russian companies understand it, is that you sit here and wait for my orders, and when I'm giving it to you, you should start working. This is how Russians view partnership. Effectively, again, my point is that if you want to make some conclusions about how things would happen in the future, just take a quick look or a more detailed look about how they were developed in the past. Because in the past decade, what happened is that major partnerships between Russian and international companies have collapsed. Partnerships which had high hopes invested in initially. Konica completely exited from Lukoil. It was a big story. It said Putin tolerates foreign companies buying 20%, up to 20% in Russian majors, and that's it. It's a good foundation for a partnership. Let's just agree on that conditions that it will work. It didn't. Konica exited. So did E.ON. I think strategically E.ON's exit from Gazprom is a far more important story, which illustrates that even a very Gazprom-leaning Western companies have no faith in strategic partnerships like that. Then you have another case like Stockmann. So build-up of new partnerships with limited participation of private interests actually is, I think, highly unlikely. So it will just go on like that. The bulk of production will be still coming from the old fields. I think these authorities are even ready to tolerate some decline. If it's not going to turn into something catastrophic, which there are no prerequisites for now. It's just that we will see stagnation coming into decline. Similarly, like Gazprom output fell last year. It's a big problem, but as far as the government is concerned, so what? They still receive a lot of money from exports. I mean, let's tolerate decline in output. That's a general, it's a very rent-seeking attitude. It's not a modernization-oriented. They are more busy now with what I just read in Kommersant today. They are more busy now trying to convince FAS, the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service, to close down the investigation against pipe suppliers to Gazprom with the potential manipulation of price for pipe. Because the Ministry of Industry is concerned that, together with pipe producers, that it might undermine competitiveness of Russian pipe producers at the South Stream pipe supply tenders. So the Minister of Industry officially asks Chairman of the Anti-Monopoly Services to drop the charges and close the investigation. That is a classical case which illustrates efficiency and development versus monopoly and rent seeking. So with cases like that, I don't expect much changes. I think significant changes in the rethinking and opening up. Well, I think we don't want to really get into that territory, but it is very much about political change. It cannot happen without major political changes in Russia.
Thank you. I have another request for a prediction for you, though. There have been recent developments between natural gas and Gazprom between the $7 billion bill that they've been asked to pay for the take-or-pay contract. Is this going to be a repeat of 2006, 2009? And if not, what's different about it this time? And if so, is it really worth risking something like this over maybe a political move?
There might be a repeat because there's generally the political sense among Russians that, well, Yanukovych is president for 3 years now, and we're not getting anything from him. that's the problem. Instead, we're giving him discounts, but he's still not delivering. He's not joining the customs union, and he's not surrendering his trunk gas pipeline system. So what was it all for? Why did he help him to become president in any case, right? So I think this had started to transfer into an active stage with this court claim, which is indeed very serious. I think that, yes, it has a chance to emerge into a major conflict with, again, cutting off gas supply. It has a chance. I'm not saying it's a definitive option, but it has a chance to evolve into something like that. Now, of course, it's going to be stupid on the Russian part because it's further going to undermine Russia's competitiveness in Europe. And I also believe that apart from the price policy and the differential with the spot prices, I think the consequences of Gazprom losing share on the European market has a great deal to do with the mental consequences of the Ukrainian crisis. Because at least it forced many countries to look for alternative sources, because at some point it's going to become an inevitable option to have them, because Ukraine is shut down, so there's no gas. So at least we need to have some other link to something. Now, if another cutoff happens, of course it's going to be stupid on the Russian part. But as they say, There are no fortresses which cannot be taken by the Bolsheviks. So I think it's, again, it was stupid to do in 2006. It was stupid to do in 2009. It never stopped them. As far as the court claim in itself, I think it's a kind of a desperate move on Putin's part. I think it's insisted by Putin personally because of this political bargain with Yanukovych. My guess is, let me say, my informed guess is that a lot of people within Gazprom have actually objected to the idea, because that has very weak perspective. Gazprom have no experience of winning litigations related to take-or-pay contracts. Moreover, it has practical experience of losing such cases in European courts. And starting from Edison, which actually sued Gazprom in 2010, and then in 2011 actually won the case, proving that some of the conditions should be changed. Now, there are fundamental problems with take-or-pay contracts, because it has different negative moments about it. It's, you force the consumer to pay for product or service which was not delivered. Another point is that the court can decide that such a decision was signed by the consumer under imposed forceful circumstances. Yet even another issue, and I think that is also one of the fundamental weaknesses of the whole take-or-pay model, which was, by the way, played out in this litigations about take-or-pay contracts, is that it's actually giving the supplier explains it by the way that they need to invest into development of fields, costly infrastructure. And actually, this whole scheme is invented as a guarantee of payback, explaining that investor is in a difficult position if the customer he was investing in development of all this infrastructure, and the customer refuses to buy, goes to someone else, and that means there was a sunk cost and so on. That was the initial legal formula of these contracts when they were invented and concluded in the 70s and 80s and 90s and so on. Now, major problem is if you sign this contract with already existing customer, where infrastructure exists, pipelines exist, gas is already being produced. You don't have to build anything. The court can actually decide that you actually want to stem super profits, imposing forceful conditions on this consumer, rather than it is actually necessary to compensate your actual investment costs, which are non-existent in the Ukrainian case. So I'm not sure about the quality of Naftogaz lawyers, but I also think that it's going to be difficult for Gazprom to win the case. It has not a single example of winning these cases. And actually, the massive voluntary concessions to many European consumers on take-or-pay contracts after they lost a couple of courts is an indirect sign that they themselves understand the weakness of the system, because they already wanted to avoid another court losses. They started to give away concessions voluntarily, which means that there is a reason why some of them probably did not want this claim against Ukraine. And Gazprom did not announce it. It was announced in a leak in Financial Times. Right. And Gazprom was not confirming it. So it means that they kind of shy away from it, because probably they understand that it's not really going to go on exactly the way planned.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have other questions? Sure. Do you think that the domestic gas price in Russia will hit European netback levels anytime soon?
I think it's already somewhere there. And the question is pretty similar about Ukraine at the moment, is whether Russian domestic gas price will go further beyond the netback price, which is, I think, the ultimate goal at the moment, because it's quite clear that Gazprom wants to use revenues from domestic market as the compensating factor from declining sales in Europe. It's happening. And the gas price is high already in Russia these days. It's well over $100 per 1,000 cubic meters. At some periods of last year, it was higher than the average domestic prices in the United States. And well, if you take a look at the benchmark on how they calculate the comparison, are the highest potential benchmark targets at the continental European market. They don't compare it with the spot market level. They are comparing it with the level of price under price formulas on Gazprom's take-or-pay contracts, the highest of them. This is how they calculate it. And if you compare, if you calculate netback from best spot market examples, it's already almost, I mean, it's just a few dollars more story, right? So it's, we're right now basically on the netback level, which is something close to a European price. This is here is where my position is very much politicized, because bringing the further price increase, gas price increase in Russia to a halt is one of the cornerstones of our political program, because we believe that it already exceeds the reasonable price which compensates necessary investment capital costs. It's a good profitable price. We need to stop right here, and we need to introduce competitive environment on the domestic market to make sure that we do not overprice consumers further. And that is one of the important issues from which Russian consumers are suffering, because if you take a look at, for instance, the inflation figures last year, we've had an unprecedented experiment where the government was not raising regulated prices from the 1st of January. It did so from the 1st of July to give people a relaxation period during the elections, not to bother them during such an important period with some negative developments and so on. So there was we had a long argument whether inflation is a purely monetary phenomenon, as Milton Friedman and others would argue, or it does depend on increase of regulated prices. We found out, unfortunately, that it does. So over 2 percentage points a year is clearly associated with that factor. And gas is the main, gas is actually the main engine behind that, because over 60% electricity in the European part of Russia is produced from gas. Obviously, on electricity, everything else depends, because communal services, heating, water supply, where costs are largely electricity. So it's quite clear that there are other components as well, but domestic gas prices is a very important component, an engine to that growth of regulated prices. We need to stop that. It's not good. We need to, we have a lot of problems from high inflation. For instance, the collapse of the pension reform is very much connected with that, because people barely speak about that, but that's a very important factor, because a lot of people who criticize non-government pension funds and managing companies and their performance, they say, well, they cannot ensure yields which are higher than inflation. Big question is, can the government do something to bring down inflation in the first place? Which did contribute a lot to problems with reforming our pension system. So actually we believe that, yet on another hand, there's been firm commitment on Putin's part to stick to the agenda of increasing domestic gas prices. That was a program which was nominally adopted in May 2007. And has been with certain delays coinciding with election periods, but still largely the program went on as initially planned. Government had relentlessly proceeded with increasing domestic gas prices. I think there is no reason to expect that it will stop at some point. Although, if you take a look at recent experiences, Putin has also been reluctant to give it a faster pace, which Gazprom promoted, but he sticks to the initially agreed plan, which is roughly 15% a year. But as far as this plan is concerned, he sticks to it very much. He never considers going back on the issue of increasing domestic gas prices.
Thank you. Great, thank you. One more question from me. What value do you think that improved transparency could add to perhaps winning back European customers of Gazprom? Right now, there's a policy that you never announce what prices and contracts they actually strike with individual buyers. If that were to be changed, would you see that as a positive step towards modernizing this?
Well, it's not just the issue of how to better sell themselves to consumers. It's the issue of rethinking their whole marketing strategy. Basically, the question is like that. Do they have anything beyond long-term take-or-pay contracts and price formulas in their pocket? Are they actually ready for, which is the process that is going on with long-term consumers? They demand more volumes in terms of pricing to be linked with the spot market.
Right.
So the big question is Gazprom ready that big time, like Qatar is for in a lot of ways, to go out there and actually submit themselves to the unpredictable, scary conditions of free market? Which is, well, you see that oil industry is pretty well used to that, and you don't have long-term take-or-pay contracts in oil, for the most part. So it all depends on sometimes highly volatile spot trade. So the gas market will inevitably be evolving in the same direction with development of LNG, development of local resources, not only shale, but many countries have the potential to develop indigenous output, like Black Sea, for instance, it's offshore, which is going to be a big boost for Romania, Ukraine, and Bulgaria, probably. So the competition is arriving big time, so Gazprom has to rethink their whole pricing policy. I'm not even ready to give specific advice on that. It also, my point is that you should gather good experts on the issue, sit them down, discuss that, consider what policy alternatives they offer. It's not just a matter of me suggesting a magic price formula, no. But the direction is quite clear. They have to move from a system where they are on the defensive, with defending their whole network of long-term contracts, which will fade away. Historically, it's inevitable. It's already in collapse. They're in retreat. So they have to go into the offensive. They have to rethink and define some strategy which, okay, we offer we see that there is a fundamental dissatisfaction among customers with the old system of contracts. Let's be frank about that. Not the actual level of price, but the system of contract obligations. Okay, we're ready to offer you something different. What? Let them sit down, think, and offer. It's their job, not mine. People are getting huge salaries in Gazprom, cosmic salaries in Gazprom Export, not just to sit and wait how the money arrives each month on their bank account under long-term contracts. Oh yeah, we checked, it's there, fine, we go have a lunch or dinner. No, it's not how Gazprom Export should work. They failed completely. This is what I told them 12 years ago when I was in the government. We had an argument about that. And I said, look guys, competition will strike you in the face, big time, be aware. They have ridiculed me, saying that you don't understand anything, it's all very high inertia, long term, goes plan. Did you see it was a very, very funny, but also telling document published by former President Medvedev on 21st of April 2009 on the Kremlin website, which was called the so-called Principles of International Energy Cooperation. suggested by Russia as an informal alternative to Energy Charter Treaty, which had included words like predictability of demand, security of demand, the need for long-term guarantees for a supplier. It didn't exactly contain the word Gosplan, but the spirit was clearly present. Fortunately, the document was forgotten almost immediately after it was released, but it was largely drafted by Gazprom and many pro-Gazprom experts, basically exposing that their thinking, their philosophy does not contain anything beyond just that. Let's chain all the world within this spider web of predictable long-term something which would secure our revenue so we can go have a lunch in a fancy restaurant. I have warned them many, many times during this 1.5 decades. We said, me and a lot of my colleagues, we said, guys, you're going to face a much harsher competitive environment. You need to change your whole thinking, revisit your marketing policy. So the problem is not changing something within the contractual framework. The problem is learn to go and trade out there in the spot market successfully, like Qatar does, because they want big gains. What happened is that Gazprom did not just lose market because of the decline of consumption in Europe. It lost much bigger share than the actual consumption. But take a look at Qatar. They want big gains in the similar period of time. We just need to learn from that experience.
Thank you.
Other questions from the students, from the audience? First students, then we'll ask professors what students should be given the priority.
Okay, well, my name is Jonathan. Thanks for coming again. I have a question about the Southern Corridor. And you mentioned that Gazprom has failed to develop offshore in Russia, offshore fields. Israel and Cyprus have some of the largest fields that have been found in the past decade, Tamar and Leviathan. Do you think with Gazprom maybe teaming up with these private companies that are going to develop these fields, if they will gain the experience that they need to develop fields back in Russia, do you think that the investment there is attainable for Gazprom? Or do they not want to develop these fields because of the shifting geopolitical spectrum in the region?
Oh, speaking about the offshore, let me tell you that there's one fundamental problem which is very, very strong. A Russian engineering school, mining school in the oil and gas industry have been developing for decades onshore, on surface. It's the Western engineers, companies, which have gained experience in Northern Sea, Gulf of Mexico, Persian Gulf, elsewhere. We have had no experience of that. Particularly, there is one more complication with Russian offshore, which also clearly distincts it from, let's say, Mediterranean. It's a totally different story. It's icy conditions and cold water. That is something strikingly different because it even imposes certain additional unique features which go well beyond the standard work in the offshore. This is actually why what makes development of the Russian greenfield project so terribly complicated. It means that my understanding of the new offshore projects in Russia, be it the Arctic Sea or be it Sakhalin or be it Kamchatka, is that each of them should be treated as an absolutely unique gathering of best examples of available international experience. It's somewhat similar to issues like, International Space Station, if you will, right? It's not even, I'm sure that Russian companies can participate in development of some of the offshore fields, teaming with other companies in places like Venezuela or Mediterranean. It's no big deal. What is important is that will it contribute significantly to creating this, breakthrough approach to big, complicated projects on the Russian shelf? I'm not sure. Again, I think these big new Russian projects should be treated as something absolutely unique because of terribly complicated conditions, and this is why my reading is that the best international experience should be encouraged, not oppressed by saying that, look guys, we have 51%, and with that 51%, we have a major say on what to do and what not. We don't have a consensus, but we say what to do, and you have somewhat, you know, a couple of chairs on the board, and if you want to say something, you have a right to do so, but not necessarily will take that into account. Stockman scheme doesn't work. So this is why teaming up is turning to be a more complicated issue. Given the rights to best experience, meaning that there's going to be a much more significant legal and commercial rights. Just for instance, take the Exxon partnership between with Rosneft in the Arctic. The fields they are about to work on are absolutely non-explored. There's just probable reserves. They need to drill. One well in this area, just drilling one exploratory well, can cost like, you know, $50 million bucks. With Exxon, the story is in particular that Exxon has a reputation of being probably the most legalistic company out of all international oil and gas majors. It probably has the best team of lawyers in the global oil and gas industry. And it's always focusing on securing the legal framework for where they operate. They have not even been afraid to sue Hugo Chavez when he wanted to nationalize their assets. Now, what is important as far as legal framework concerned, so it's not about technology, it's not about just teaming up as an informal agreement, it's also about legal framework. Russian, for instance, subsoil legislation has a huge problem. It doesn't contain the framework for what is called in the Western legislation the right for commercial discovery to the extent the Western legislation does. It has some mentioning of it, but there is no absolute guarantee that if you spend a lot of money, drill a lot of $50 million wells, discover something, government will not say, thank you, you've done your job so far, here is your slight compensation, and we will auction the fields in which you cannot take part because of the Russian legislation. This is how it can happen with an Exxon-Rosneft Arctic partnership. I think it's going to be well beyond the existing Exxon practices if they will allow themselves to sort of take this risk in a relaxed manner. I'm sure they will make every effort to secure their legal position once the commercial discovery is achieved. On the other hand, it means that Exxon's rights for not just granted partnership, right? You have to clearly distinguish between legal rights firmly secured, which government cannot interfere with, from a granted partnership, which means that if Exxon behaves, the partnership goes on. If it does not, which is a very vague question, what is that? Then problems might occur. I think that are the obstacles, just beyond technical ones, for development of the Russian offshore, and that also very much has to do with the political model of development of the industry.
Ram? Yeah. First of all, thank you for your speech. I got a question about third-party access in Russia.
Sorry, about what?
About third-party access.
Yeah.
Access to in Russia. Because like you said, we shouldn't focus too much on the legal aspect of that. Because I'm just really wondering why it's impossible for Russia to implement a system of regulated third-party access. And on top of that, why wouldn't Russia be able to copy the system like the EU has in Russia?
Because Gazprom has such a political weight, then if any regulator comes, there's been many examples. If any regulator comes with a suggestion like that, Miller writes a letter to Putin, or phones Putin, and Putin puts a veto. This is why no regulator have been able to impose third-party access. The way, if you take a look at the current governmental resolution which regulates third-party access, which is 858 resolution from 1997 with many historic amendments, actually it does not impose the regulatory principle on third-party access. It is also it entitles government and its agency with the right, you know, like an arbiter in case some kind of dispute arises. It does not provide that the governmental agencies have direct right to interfere and impose conditions on how the third-party access is granted. It's just like the Commission is on considering the disputes on access. So dispute is granted by Gazprom, and if somebody is refused, it can appeal, and the government agencies can only deal with the appeal, not with the initial framework. This is how weak it is at the moment in legal terms. There's been multiple attempts to change that. Gazprom always resisted and always won because of its political weight. I think I just explained the mechanics of it.
Colleague?
This is regarding unconventionals, shale oil and shale gas. Miller's previously stated he doesn't think they have a future in Russia, maybe. And recently Putin said he'd like to see more development in that field in Russia. Do you think Gazprom and Rosneft will do that on their own, or maybe through PSAs?
Well, PSA so far in Russia, unfortunately, is non-existent. This regime is not applicable because of unfortunate amendments adopted 3 years ago. As far as shale gas and oil, it's very clear to see that there's a direct correlation. The countries which are the most active in development of indigenous shale gas and oil production are simultaneously dependent on imports. Or, with the exception of Canada, right? Canada has a big neighboring market which is dependent on imports. Russia does not have that problem. In this regard, there is no stimulus to work for that because it's more complicated. We lack this technology, is more costly, and we have a lot of steel bulk comes from depleting oil and gas fields. We have a lot of traditional sources of production. It's very much like with renewable sources of energy. We had no motivation, the government had no motivation to focus on development of those over years because we have been so filthy rich with hydrocarbons, conventional. So why would we, go into something more? And particularly with Gazprom, the problem is that it has been, for some reason, in denial of the shale gas revolution, saying, oh, it's overestimated. Oh, something overestimated which finally hit them in the face. But this public denial gives you an illustration of how unimportant the issue is considered by these guys. Now, maybe they will try to jump into it, particularly because they would want to establish control over development of shale resources in some countries which might do so, be it, from Lithuania to Romania to Bulgaria. They will maybe try it. At this moment, I think the issue is way too far. If you're talking about this in practical terms, I cannot tell you. We can only hypothetically theorize that this might be the case. As far as the current on-the-ground practical situation is concerned, there are no signs that active development of shale is going to be the issue within the next few years, despite Putin's words. Putin had said many words over the course of past 13 years. Doesn't necessarily mean something, particularly when we come down to a certain complicated, innovative process. Words mean even less.
Yes, Laura?
Just kind of a follow-up to that. Would you then say that it's more likely that Gazprom will develop the LNG or the Arctic?
Currently, there are no viable perspectives for development of new Russian LNG plants by Gazprom. We have Sakhalin-2, which is, frankly speaking, not a Gazprom project. Gazprom has only managed to jump in and take control, seize control over it. It's a Shell's project, right? And there is a possibility that there's going to be new lines of LNG production built. It's going to be expanded to take more gas from Sakhalin fields. There is a project which is in advanced stage of discussion, Yamal LNG, but that is Timchenko and Novatek project. It's not Gazprom project. The only project which Gazprom is pushing so far is Vladivostok LNG, which is supposed to collect gas from Sakhalin and Yakutia, liquefy it and supply to the Asian Pacific market. But the negotiations are just in preliminary, early stages. They are doing some feasibility study together with Japanese companies, and as far as I understand, there are huge difficulties of the economic nature because Gazprom wants to build very, very long and costly pipelines to deliver gas from the producing upstream fields, which puts the economics of the project into question. So I expect that there will be more delays with further developing Vladivostok LNG project. Apart from that, there is nothing, and there is a good explanation why Gazprom has not been very active in developing LNG. I have even witnessed this argument between top managers of Gazprom somewhere around 10 years ago. Because there is a pipeline construction lobby which has its alternative profit center, if you will. Just take a look at the rating of top 400 Russian companies. You'll see Stroygazmontaj and Stroygaz Consulting who benefit from construction of new pipelines in top 20 Russian companies. Biggest Russian companies are contractors of Gazprom related to pipeline construction. There are no firms of that scale in Russia who are producing equipment for LNG development. If we are to invest in LNG development, we have to buy from Koreans. And these important guys who have to feed their families somehow and share maybe something with somebody higher in the Russian power circles, they will be stripped out of contracts. Koreans will have all the contracts. That is one important factor which unfortunately undermined LNG development in Russia in the past couple of decades, unfortunately, and given away the priority towards construction of costly and questionable pipelines, streams, and so on, some of which are barely in demand by the market. That's the explanation.
Yuri?
Yeah. What's your estimation on the results of the electricity sector?
It's a very important question. I'm sorry for skipping that because of time constraints, but I will obviously answer now.
I can imagine I have the same question.
In the black and white mode, very negative. Very negative. I think the reform has failed so far, terribly, by the way, because there are no visible signs that the current problems which occurred can be corrected. One major idea behind this reform, for which Chubais had managed to trade off the liberalization and deregulation of price, was competition. He said that government should take away control over prices, but instead we offer you a competitive environment. There is nothing like competitive environment in the electricity sector at the moment, because of one simple problem. Because the assets during the privatization of generation sector were largely given away to very limited number of companies, most of whom are affiliated with the state. Gazprom, Interrao, Rusgidro, Rosatom. And if you summarize that with guys like Deripaska or Suek, what you get is like 75% of power generation effectively controlled by the cartel of government-affiliated companies.
You're anticipating implementation of the law.
Is that something even remotely reminiscent of a competitive environment? No. Which means that, and government was tolerating that, and actually Chubais was not only tolerating but actually encouraging that, because we've had many arguments with him on that. Our last conversation happened in March 2006, directly when I said you're so much focusing by habit, I think, on how successfully the generation privatization auctions go, so that you completely disregard of who's buying it and what's going to happen if Gazprom buys anything. He said, it doesn't matter, they pay a lot of money. This is what Chubai said to me. Now we see the result is total lack of competitive environment at the power market. It's quite clear that the government is not rushing with the deregulation so far. And not just because it doesn't see a competitive environment emerging, but because they don't want to let go of a very specific regulatory leverage. The philosophy of the current authorities is control. Control over everything. Important assets, cash flows, and so on. I've never seen them giving away much. Largely, the instinct was exactly the reverse, like that. Actually, it's when I was like, you know, some time ago, when the reform just began, it was actually 2006. I actually lost, when I was very actively in conversation with one of the companies which invested in certain electricity assets in Russia, generation assets. I have lost an opportunity for a consultancy contract because I've given the preliminary presentation where I argued that the government will not deliver to its commitment of completely liberalizing the market. It will continue introducing some kind of price caps, some terribly complicated system. Basically what we have, one of the failures of the market system is that government and RAO US, and particularly the team of Yuri Udaltsov, if you know whom I'm talking about, had made a major mistake by introducing an overcomplicated system of electricity trade in Russia, which should have been much more simple than it's currently now. We have the capacity market, we have the long-term contracts market, we have day ahead, and we have all this. It's one of the most complicated systems of trade you can imagine in the Russian conditions, particularly given the problem of lack of proper territorial interconnection, because we have just zones poorly interconnected with lines, which makes the wholesale unified market complicated thing to manage. So we have this complicated system where government has a lot of leverage to interfere and impose, dictate, and so on, and not completely liberalize. These over-centralized vertical authorities, as they are today, with their philosophy and everything, now it's very hard to imagine that they would let go of such an important control leverage. This is why what you see is you see failures on both competitive environment promise and deregulation promise, which delivers headache to both consumers and the investors. You see the average industrial electricity price is starting to actually become higher than that of the United States, which one of the features of the US electricity pricing is that to a significant extent, because of the deregulation, it's been extremely stable over time, like 6 cents per kilowatt hour, much higher than we had 15 years ago, but it's very stable over time. And we instead see prices increasing. That is also associated with the pressure from domestic prices on gas, which are increased in an administrative manner. But still, well, my question to Chubais is, where's the result? You promised containment of tariffs, you promised competitive environment, you promised favorable environment for investors and deregulation. Now where is that? It's not just it's not that the idea of reform was wrong. It was right. In the US, it works. Now where is that in Russia? Where is the delivery on promises? It just didn't happen. That's the problem with electricity reform.
So you think this question that was a mistake of construction, or it is a story about we cannot make ideal market in not market environment?
There were two major problems. One of the problems is that there were substantial elements within the reform design which did not protect the whole system from strong anti-competitive effects. Namely, first, the generation sector. We wrote a big paper together with Evgeny Yasin back in April 2003, me and him, saying that if the government does not make sure that as many possible investors, private foreign investors, will take part in generation capacity auctions, and if the government, through anti-monopoly measures, does not secure that some of the players do not acquire dominant market share, and particularly we argue that the state needs to completely exit, there should be no such thing as Rus Hydro. Because when initially, Rus Hydro is one of the huge damaging factors to the market, because initially, when the generation companies were formed, there was a brilliant team of guys headed by Igor Sorokin, who actually calculated the competitive effects on the market and suggested the composition of 10 wholesale generation companies according to Herfindahl-Hirschman index, competitive environment and monopoly power index. They have done a terribly good job of calculating the effects, and on that base it was suggested that we have 4 hydro generation companies instead of 1. And it was not expected that either 4 or 1 hydro generation companies will continue to end up in the hands of the state. No, that was not the plan. These details emerged further. So generation and securing competitive environment was a vital part of the whole plan. Chubais and his team completely disregarded that. They paid no attention whatsoever and tolerated the anti-competitive trends in generation ownership. The other problem with the reform design is that on many levels, like configuration of consumer service companies, SBT, right? It was intentionally, because RAO US, there was a much stronger interference from government and independent regulators was needed, because RAO US cannot manage that proper. RAO US and their managers was fundamentally interested in de facto preserving the regional monopoly environment in distribution and retail sales, while making it look like it's a competitive environment now. That was very clearly the case. It was visible when RAO US was split. It was absolutely 150% manageable. It was very clear what to do. It was suggested. It was ignored. So we have a lot of anti-competitive effects during the whole chain, from generation to now merging of ФСК and МРСК into российские сети, further reconsidering the initial concept, to retail sales, which is, you know, it's only nominally competitive, but you have same situation as a petroleum products trade, where there's nominally multiple of them, but in each territory, a cartel of several of them controls everything, does not allow independents to come in, is in strong agreement with, informal agreement with authorities, acting collectively and so on. The other big part is that the whole reform did not take into account the huge risks, which I would name the 2. First, emergence of Gazprom as a big player. You know, when we initially started designing the electricity reform, we had no idea. We actually believed that Gazprom would be unbundled into a similar fashion, except that RAO US would be a pioneer and Gazprom would follow later. Had anyone told us then, in 1999-2000, then this thing would emerge as it is now, and we'll start buying electricity companies, I can only imagine it would have had a nightmarish effect on us. We have to reconsider the whole concept given that risk, because we actually made vulnerable opening up sector completely exposed to that predatory expansion by Gazprom, with clear advantages it had. And another problem is that, which we also talked about with Chubais, but it was an absolutely ridiculous story. Because I told him, Anatoly Borisovich, you have a problem here. Because you are very much invested into the idea that government will be committed to its initial deregulation and price liberalization plan. But, I said, you know how our government works. There is a huge certainty, at least, that at some point some nasty people in the government would say, maybe we need not rush that much and not liberalize the prices as we initially promised. Maybe we have to keep some controls, some price caps, and so on. Guess what Chubaisev answered to that? He said, you don't understand about anything. I have all the understanding and access in high circles. I will solve this problem. Don't interfere. That's not your concern, he said to me. The result is before your eyes. So what is important is that the initial plan should have been cross-checked and verified because of the newly emerging threats of government not keeping its commitment on deregulation and factors emerging like Gazprom. There was, an answer should be given to that risk. There was very severe risks to the whole reform concept, which did play out. And there was absolutely no defense. And it's Chubai's fault.
Oh, yes,
thank you for the talk. I'm just wondering if you could please comment on the need for the liberalisation and the introduction of individual private companies into the gas and oil markets, and whether this should come predominantly from domestic companies or from foreign companies.
Well, so far, this is actually what I began with. There was the initial concept of policy which was launched 20 years ago, gradual opening up to foreign investment, opening up to private capital. What is important as far as research is concerned, Maurizio, I think I can send you a link. There was a very good paper. I have actually seen nothing good as far as comparative analysis is concerned as that, which was written by Bill Thompson from OECD and published as far as in 2006, where he actually did a comparative study of oil industry, just oil, in 5 CIS countries: Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. His conclusion was that Russia had achieved an absolutely unique effect, something which another big oil producers in post-Soviet space like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan did not achieve, as emergence of very important national private players. Because the Azeri and Kazakh model was all about giving away everything to foreign companies in one or another manner. And what we managed to do, we managed to create national capital, competitive private companies in the national industry, Lukoil, TNK-BP, and others, Yukos, of course. So that was the policy which actually became reversed about a decade ago. And it's still, I think, answering a question from one of the colleagues. He said, do you think that is going to change? No. That is the philosophy of the current authorities, to keep everything under control, to allow only limited, controlled participation of outsiders, private and foreign investors. You see that takeovers of private companies are still continuing. TNK-BP is one of the examples. So I don't see any objective prerequisites for change of that trend. Recent decade policy trend was about increasing governmental control, not allowing more private players in. Again, I don't see any, some people talk about this as an opportunity. I don't see any practical proof from recorded government actions in past years that they can actually opt for more opening up, engagement of private initiative, private players, and so on.
Anyone else?
Thank you very much for your talk. My question refers to recent WTO accession of Russia. Do you see, or do you expect any changes in terms of institutional environments, competition, which should be expected or expected by foreign investors in the energy sector? You know, there are several principles of WTO which make Russia rethink its role to be. And how are you see other reasons for Russia to become a member of WTO, to become open to boost TRS in energy sector?
Well, my opinion on WTO is very simple. Don't expect any major immediate impact on the economy. There's no such thing as long-term effects will eventually take place, largely not in the energy sector, because energy sector so far has been basically exempt from influence of the issue of whether Russia is within WTO or outside. Russian energy commodities are internationally competitive. There is no such thing as protection from energy imports, and there is no need for, because we have plenty of resources, right? WTO will have longer-term effects on certain very, very specific sectors of the Russian economy, including car making or agricultural machinery production and so on. As far as energy is concerned, for the energy companies, it seemed like this issue was irrelevant to them in some way, except for a few issues like agreement with European Union on accession conditions, when Russia gave a commitment to elevate domestic energy prices to a certain level, but we already basically reached that. And we have been discussing that Putin is firmly keeping his commitment to increase natural gas prices. That's not going to be an issue. So basically in this regard, particularly for the energy sector, WTO accession hardly changes anything. I dare say it hardly changes anything for the whole Russian economy in the shorter perspective. In the longer term, yes, it will force Russia to be more competitive. It might also open an opportunity for more higher added value products manufacturing be opening in Russia with the help of foreign investment, because that was more difficult to do when Russia is not a member of WTO, because Russian goods can be discriminated. Now they cannot because we're a member. So investors might be more relaxed about opening higher added value goods production in our country. However, there are other obstacles to that, which is so-called investment climate, which is a bigger issue than WTO. I think you can hardly find any topic which has been, overheated and overestimated in public discussion than WTO. Everybody talks about that, but hardly changes anything at the moment. This is what I think.
Thanks for your presentation and very detailed answers. I like very much your comparison between success story of reforming of coal industry and a total failure with the gas industry. But if we have a look on public opinion, whatever survey we will take, or just ask ordinary people, we will figure out that actually, despite such diverse results of nationalization and privatization, absolute majority of the people would oppose privatization in one way or another, especially in these areas like gas sector, which affect virtually everyone. And when I think why, despite all this public opposition to privatization, at least some sectors were successfully privatized, I believe that one of explaining factors was that things were so disastrous in the coal industry in the 1990s that probably people give up any objection. There was no way other than doing some reforms. Should we expect things like that for other sectors of Russian energy? If, imagine one day, this lack of incentives for reforms for the government, which is currently in place, will face with very tough conditions of international market because of shale gas, because of many other things. So what kind of exogenous shock should happen in order to challenge this status quo? probably similar like what happens with the problem in the 90s.
Well, Vladimir, you raised several very hugely important layers of issues. It's very difficult to address in a short manner. I will try. First is the public perception of privatization. It's a stark contrast with the actual results achieved. And the reasons why that happens are very complicated. One of the reasons, however, is that the story of privatization of oil industry was not at all complete success. There's been also many failures as well. One of the failures was that, speaking about the effects on the energy market itself, very visible to the public eye, the oligopoly of oil companies and the domestic petroleum market, which is not very consumer friendly. You see gasoline prices high and rising, and even the people who have no understanding of the sector economics clearly can smell the fish, because they know that the monopoly effects are there. Because if you just drive 200 kilometers, despite all, they hire brilliant economists, libertarians who would tell you that this is all in correlation with the world international oil price and it cannot go any other way. But you just drive 200 kilometers away from Moscow and you see same gasoline from the same refinery, actually, costing 2 rubles less, because of the purchase power in that territory is not as high as within the Moscow Ring Road, right? So that is one of the failures of the reform. We were not able to create a competitive refined products market, which should be addressed. And also this publicly exposed oil wealth and the flood of oil money actually coming and contributing to raising social inequality was a terribly difficult factor to deal with. And I believe this is what shaped public opinion in a larger sense. It's really hard to argue, to make the case that from an industry point of view, privatization was successful when it also had such an adverse negative social effect. It's one against the other, and of course public regards the second one much bigger than. But what is also important is that I have to say that, and I always keep telling all the Chubaises and Gozmans of this world, and I was telling this to Igor Gaidar when he was still alive. Now these people had one big problem. They did a lot of good things. They did a lot of controversial things to this country, but they also did a lot of good things. Now, speaking about the good things, they were completely unable to publicly sell it to the people, to create a good explanation of what they have achieved. That was their complete failure all over time, even now. Because I just told you the story of what was achieved in the oil and gas production industries. And these guys, they have no clue. They have to ask me to give the evaluation of the results of what they have done, So I think there's a huge problem of the results of these reforms being undersold publicly. We need to speak about that more. It's hard to do now because of, free discussion is a bit oppressed in the society, and the authorities don't like the conclusions which I'm making during the course of this presentation right now. But it's important. It should be addressed. Now, as to driving forces beyond the restructuring, what you mentioned is that actually the driving force was some kind of catastrophic decline, which had inevitably forced the government to throw out everything and try that private capital will save everything. That was an important consideration, but I think that was only the top of the iceberg. And then Gazprom situation was also not brilliant. But why did the government keep it central and privatized everything else? And it's pretty much the same. Dyakov in RAO-ES had very much opposed. He wanted the same decree on RAO-ES as Chernomyrdin lobbied on Gazprom in June 1992, that RAO-ES is kept central. However, with RAO US it was much more complicated, but actually the reform started then, not in 2000, but in 92. When Pyotr Mostovoy, you obviously remember him, right? He actually managed to make it that in Yeltsin's decree on transforming RAO US from a state enterprise into a shareholder company, it was already broken up into a very complicated structure of different subsidiary joint stock companies. Our Energo separated power stations, which was a preliminary prerequisite for further restructuring. That was a necessary step. Now, quick separation and privatization of oil industry was not a product of government thinking. It was largely a result of decentralization trends sparked by oil industry generals. Oleg Perov, Bogdanov, Muravlenko. They wanted their companies to be separated and become private. Some managed to privatize it for themselves, like Oleg Perov or Bogdanov Surgutneftegas. Some did not manage and were swallowed by these emerging financial groups like Yukos and Sibneft. Actually, these strong industry generals, which wanted to take away pieces and make it their own, right? This was a very important driving force, which actually helped the reformers of the government. Now, one thing I always blamed Vekherev for, the late Vekherev, my condolences and everything, but immediately after Vekherev became chairman of Gazprom, what he tried to do, and he completed that successfully by middle and 90s, is that he did register all the fixed capital stock, all the funds of this local production and transport subsidiaries for the central office, making the subsidiaries like Yambur Gazdobыча nothing but a limited liability service companies, or which were basically operating on Gazprom's fixed stock just for a remuneration fee. That was a completely different story, because Lukoil already by the end of 92 had physically and legally controlled all their fields, wells, and refineries, and so on. In Gazprom, they had quickly eliminated the possibility for such separatist trends, if you will, and that's not easy. That's not easy to restore. So I think you need not to underestimate the call for restructuring from the industry itself, and also as far as catastrophic scenarios are concerned. As far as the current environment, I don't see any catastrophic scenarios really emerging. I think rather than the situation is much more heated in the political system than in the energy. So I think if the changes are about to come, they will spill over from the political part of it. Because in politics, people would come who have different ideas how to manage our whatever we have in the energy sector. I don't believe that this time around reforms and changes will be a result of a catastrophic developments within the energy sector, which are not visible in sight. I don't think trends are bad, they're negative, difficulties will increase, but it's nothing compared to the catastrophic situation we had in coal or oil industries in the late 80s, early 90s. Nothing compared. That should be appreciated. I hope I did answer.
Okay, thank you. Have any other questions? Yes? No? Well, thank you very much.